All right, friends, we're back. We're talking about the Mideast Part 2, and in this particular version, we're specifically looking at Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And so when we talk about those, we're talking about Jordan here, Lebanon, which would be up here. It's not a very good map. And then we're talking about Syria for the most part. So Jordan has been under a king, and the name of the guy is King Hussein. And since 1999, under his son King Abdullah, he has had to steer offers often treacherous path between Arab neighbors, so Palestine and Iraq, and its Western allies, so the United States specifically. Um, Now we're specifically talking about Jordan right now, and although King Hussein fiercely opposed the 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, he himself made peace back in 1994, and so to this day, crazy enough, Israel remains officially at war with Syria and Lebanon, although it's not considered a hot war. They still have actual declaration of war active, but they haven't had any shooting, things like that, official shootings. So now, in part because of its dependence on oil from Iraq, Jordan sat out the first Gulf War. Really jeopardized the relationship with the U.S. And then the collapse of the Iraqi oil industry after the invasion um, deprived Jordan of its main fuel source. So ever since then, they've been kind of on the road to recovery economically. Um, the official name, excuse me, is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the capital is Amman. Now, it's not very many people, so 6.5 million, um, maybe double the size of Minnesota, I guess, one way to talk about it. Life expectancy is pretty average, 72 years for men, 75 for women. And of course, the major religion is Islam. Now, moving on to Lebanon. Again, this has been a pretty contentious area. So when we talk about war, most of them now in the last decade haven't been at war, but the 20 to 30 years before that have been pretty contentious. Since 1991, Lebanon has been putting itself together because they had a 16-year civil war. It was brutal, very devastating, during which the capital, okay, here's Beirut, was once known as the Paris of the Middle East. It's right on the Mediterranean Sea. It's a beautiful area, but it was basically rubble. And I don't have a picture of it in this, but you could look up a picture of Beirut during the Civil War. You can see there wasn't more than a few handful of buildings left standing. Um, so it did involve troops from Israel, but they did eventually withdrew the troops. The issue is that Syria still has a sizable force inside Lebanon, so it's still a pretty um, conflicted area, I guess would be the way to put it. And it's from people outside of the country. So Israel coming from the south, Syria coming from the west. They also have a radical group, a Shia group called Hezbollah, which you've probably heard in the news once in a while. Even nowadays, it's pretty firmly entrenched there. Now, Shia is the large minority of the Islamic group, just to refresh your memory on that. Now, again, the Lebanese people are very entrepreneurial. They've got a big banking industry, light manufacturing, but this has all been in the last, I don't know, like 10 years, 15 years, where they've really started to rebuild after the Civil War. And you can see there, they've got 4.3 million people. It's a pretty small area, 10,500 square kilometers, so 4,000 square meters, or square miles, excuse me. Trying to put that into I don't know, that's kind of like maybe 3 Minneapolis St. Paul's would be the way to look at it. So it's not a huge area for 4.3 million people. There are some rural areas, I guess would be the way to put it. Now, a few years ago, I'm jumping around a little bit, but this is kind of a curious thing where about 2 years ago, the Lebanese Prime Minister, his name is Saad Hariri, announced his resignation while he was in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is back November 4th, 2019. So, Iran and Hezbollah, so again, that's that Shia Islamist party in or at one point was, and maybe still is, I should check, labeled as a terrorist group based in Lebanon, accused Saudi Arabia of holding him hostage. And there's a growing concern that Lebanon was becoming drawn into the tensions between the Shia Muslim power in Iran and Saudi Arabia. And again, everywhere outside of Iraq and Iran is mostly Sunni. Now, his televised remarks a week prior to stepping down said he was stepping down because of a threat to his life. But it's a very weird situation where he kind of did it out of the blue. He did it because he was worried about a threat to his life, and he accused the Hezbollah of trying to take over with Iran's backing. And that's going to be a common theme for a lot of these countries, is Iran backing Shia groups, trying to, even though they're a minority, trying to take over, and not in a necessarily non-violent way. He hasn't spoken publicly since 2019, which is another kind of crazy thing for a leader of a country. Okay, on to Syria. Now, this is the one that we're going to be spending just a little bit extra time this week, and we're doing a couple projects on it. A local branch of Saddam Hussein, so you probably remember, he was the former leader of Iraq. Now, he had a branch of that Ba'ath Party, so it's kind of a political party, governed Syria, and then that's since 1970. It's been under the Ba'ath Party leadership, but then there's a dictatorship of Hafez al-Assad, okay? And you'll probably recognize the al-Assad name. The long-standing conflict between Syria and Israel centers on Israel's capture of the Golan Heights from Syria back in 1967. So I don't have a map of it right here, but the Golan Heights obviously is real close to the two areas, right? And then now, since 2003, when the Iraq War ended, Syria's been under pressure from the United States because they've been accused of harboring a lot of Saddam Hussein's former generals, regime members, and even some of the chemical weapons that were possibly in Iraq maybe made their way over, things like that. There's been quite a bit of tension. And al-Assad has been not really a popular guy. Syria's been in the middle of a civil war for a majority of the last 9 years. So it began in March 2011 after government security forces shot and killed some protesters. Okay, so the protesters were gathered to demand a release of a group of boys who were detained for spraying some anti-government stuff on school walls. And then, so in March that happened. In April, President Obama urged Bashar al-Assad, the son, he's now the dictator or the leader. Now technically they have elections, but he's a dictator in all but name. He ordered, so again, Obama urged Assad to resign, and he ordered all Syrian government assets in the U.S. to be frozen. So that's a pretty big step. Now, this continued for a couple years, and there's a lot of fighting going on, little skirmishes here and there. By 2013, reports, so about 2 years after this, that al-Assad was conducting chemical gas attacks against his own citizens and rebels. So like sarin gas, chlorine gas, some pretty nasty stuff. Obama asked Congress to use military force against his regime, but at that point the Republican-controlled legislature failed to grant the permission. Now, the United Nations threatened to use force against Syria if al-Assad didn't destroy his stockpiles of chemical weapons. And if you remember from our UN unit, one of their main chunks of the UN is an organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons. And so that's one of their big things that the UN does. It announced about in June 2014, that it removed all the chemical weapons from Syria. But there's a lot of people that still think that they still have a lot of hidden chemical weapon supplies in Syria. By August 2015, the UN Security Council had appointed, again, their chemical weapons division, and UN some other UN experts to investigate. And so again, he had already, after they had claimed that he had taken them all out, he had used chemical weapons against his own citizens, which is kind of crazy to think about. So again, a couple more pictures from the Syrian Civil War. All right, so again, continuing the story. So September 2015, now Russia is providing al-Assad with military aid. So it's become now a proxy war. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, it's when maybe two larger countries, more superpower-ish, like the US, Russia, China, things like that, support wars in other areas to fight their battles for them, I guess would be the way to do it. And so in September 2015, Russia provided al-Assad with some military aid and kind of actively enters the conflict. Russian Air Force carries out bombing attacks against the opponents of al-Assad and also accused of deliberately bombing civilian targets, which is kind of a crazy, when you stop and think about it. Now, the chemical weapons from the UN did determine around this time that he did use the chemical weapons on at least 3 occasions, which is kind of crazy. Now, at the same time this is all going on, so there's ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So that's the long name, but ISIS, we've probably heard that as a terrorist group. They're also fighting. They're also using mustard gas in Syria. So it's just kind of a crazy, you've got multiple groups fighting for territory, fighting for control, and as you can see from the devastation, it's kind of crazy. Now we continue on to February 2017. China and Russia vetoed, now remember they're permanent members of the Security Council, vetoed a resolution that called on for sanctions against Syria, but they vetoed it. Now we fast forward to April of the same year, so a couple months later, at least 58 people were killed in what appears to be nerve gas attacks in the town of Khan Shaykhun, in a rebel-held Idlib province. So another nerve gas attack in 2017. Victims show the signs, convulsions, foaming at mouth, and the crazy part is witnesses are claiming that the attack was carried out by Russian jets and possibly Syrian, but probably Russian jets. And both Moscow, Damascus, both countries deny the allegations. 2007, so move up to April. U.S. fires a barrage of cruise missiles at the military base where the attacks are believed to have originated from. Now, by now, 2017, this is Donald Trump has taken office, and he defends the attack, saying it was vital to national security interests. Now, May of that same year, Trump approves military plans to arm the Kurdish rebels and retake the Syrian city of Raqqa from the IS militants. Okay, so the move really ticks off NATO ally of Turkey, who's in the area, who's long sparred over the treatment of Kurds. They're not really fond of the Kurdish people, and we're going to talk a little bit about them. But it kind of ticked off our friends, is the short version of this. Now, that's in May. So in July, Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to a limited ceasefire. So this is the U.S. and Russia agreeing to a ceasefire in a third country. And this is after 6 years of fighting. So they're, crazy weary. There's mustard gas use. People are fleeing, refugees all over the place. And now, so that's July 7th. July 9th, the ceasefire takes effect. If you're worried about it, it's around noon. But by July 23rd, so 2 weeks later, Syrian warplanes bombed the suburbs of Damascus. All right, so not even 2 weeks later. And so it's been kind of a tough place for a long time. Now, during this, a group called the Islamic State of Iraq, okay, that's ISIS, and now they call themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. All right, Levant was the biblical name of Syria, just to put it out there. and they can say ISIL or ISIS, depending on who you talk to and what's going on, right? So they're really stuck on implementing Sharia law. So that's Islamic law rooted back in the 8th century, so 700 CE, 1300 years ago. And life back then was very different than what it is now, right? So they're trying to establish a society that looks like that. Just that's their goal. All right. So they're growing because of all the conflict. They're gaining followers. The country's in chaos. People are leaving. People are getting um, hit with mustard gas, sarin gas, chlorine gas, and there's a ton of people leaving. So one of the things we're going to focus on is the Syrian refugee crisis. And crazy stat is that of Syria right here, 1 in 5 Syrians is now a refugee in some neighboring country. So if there's 5 of you standing in a room, one of them would be living in a different country as a refugee. And you can see the numbers here. Turkey has 2 million, Lebanon is 1 million, Iraq 200,000, Jordan 630, and so on. And there's other other refugees in other countries like Germany, things like that in Europe. Greece, I know Greece has quite a few Syrian refugees. All right, so I want to pause this. All right, this is I will say there's some unpleasant images. These are the stories of the people as refugees from Syria. Pause my video, click down to the slideshow below, and watch the video. And I think you'll come away with a pretty good take on this situation. Okay, so now you've paused the video and you've watched it. We are going to move on to the next slide. And the first assignment from this video is I want you to click on this link. So again, you're going to have to use the slideshow. And you're going to kind of go through a journey of a Syrian refugee. And I want you to reflect on it, all right? And there's a discussion board about the simulation. You're going to have to post before you can see other people's, or other people can see yours and you can see theirs. If you get a discussion going, that's great. If you feel like not discussing anybody else's posts, I'm okay with that. But I do want you to go through the journey, reflect on it, and make your statement. Okay. If you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, have a great day.